Greetings and welcome to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the American Society of Naval Engineers podcast. I am your host, Stephen Phillips. In this podcast, we talk a little and learn a lot about naval engineering while inspiring the next generation of STEM professionals. Today, I'm joined by Troy Kimmel to learn more about the story of Aegis 15 years later, a special edition of the Naval Engineers Journal. Troy, thanks for joining me on the podcast. I really look forward to this discussion.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. This has been a labor of love. The second time around, it was a little bit harder the first time around because we were dealing with some of the original people that actually built Aegis from scratch back in the 70s. It's just been a wonderful experience getting to figure out and see what has happened with Aegis over the last 15 years.
Troy, why don't we start with you introducing yourself to the ASNE audience? Give us your brief bio, if you would.
Yeah, I graduated with an engineering degree in 1995, went to work for a small company named Techmatics. Had a lot of work with the surface Navy in those days, and they took me to meet this grumpy old guy who rented space from them, and his name was Admiral Wayne Meyer. And I didn't know him from a hole in the wall. So I naturally was very curious about this Aegis thing that he was telling me about, and I pestered him so much that he took me under his wing and agreed to start teaching me. And he really became a mentor of mine. I was able to work with him for about 13 years and with the surface Navy, Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense, before it was even called Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense. Then working, once IWS was created in 2002, working with Captain Hill and later Admiral Hill on the really everything to do with Aegis, failure review boards, special studies with Admiral Meyer for Admiral Mullen when he was the Chief of Naval Operations. And then finally, in the last several years, moved over to the Missile Defense Agency, which has been really, really an experience to see what MDA has evolved to over time. I mean, this large global system of systems that was just a dream 23 years ago is now out there, and Aegis is a big part of it.
It is amazing to see it. I'll tell you what.
It is.
So, for background, for those in the audience that may not be familiar, what is Aegis?
Aegis can be thought of in three different ways. Aegis first in the 1970s was the Navy's attempt to develop a much more integrated real-time combat system or weapon system to deal with the area air defense threat. So standard missile, a new display system, weapons control, fire control, all put under one organizational construct, PMS 403 at first, later called PMS 400, with first Captain Wayne Meyer running it, later Admiral Wayne Meyer running it. As the system progressed, they realized they could use this very much more capable weapon system to drive a lot of the other warfare areas in the ship. So the Aegis combat system was created in that era, and a very big land-based test site was developed up in Morristown, New Jersey, to bring that to sea and test it before we put it to sea. One of the big problems Admiral Meyer was going to work on was systems before Aegis were not ready when they went to sea. He was going to fix that, and he had the will and the rancor to get that done. Finally, there's the Aegis ships. Putting an Aegis ship under an ordnance engineering duty officer, which is what Admiral Meyer was a brand new thing at the time. But it was the right thing to do because the new system, weapon system and the combat system were so tightly integrated that you couldn't just create another program office and hope that it would all work out well for the ship. So the ship was put under PMS 400, the first class, a cruiser, the second class later, a destroyer, and we continue on building those destroyers today. I believe, and we haven't been able to find an example to the contrary, that is the longest running shipbuilding program in U.S. history and potentially world history.
As suggested by the title, there was a similar edition that was published 15 years ago. Presumably, therefore, this edition is an update. So, for both editions, what's the overall goal and intent of publishing the story of Aegis?
I mean, the original was written to coincide with the commissioning of the USS Wayne E. Meyer. And we were lucky at that time to still have some of the originals who put Aegis to sea and worked on the development still alive, who could contribute to it. And we got these are people like Admiral James Doyle, who was the OPNAV sponsor for years. Actually, he was 5 years as what was known as OPO 3 back in those days. Had a lot of power and helped Admiral Meyer get that over the finish line. Joe Threston was the vice president of RCA Moorestown, the weapon and the combat system engineer. Ralph Hawes and James Whalen. One was the VP of General Dynamics Pomona, and one had worked for years as a civil servant in PMS 422 Standard Missile. They were able to tell the story of going from Terrier Tartar Talos to Standard Missile 1 to Standard Missile 2. Randy Fortune and Captain Brian Perkinson recounted the whole story of how did we get the cruiser to sea and later DDG-51, which both were built under very different circumstances. Admiral J.T. Hood, who was a former PMS 400 himself after Meyer had retired, gave his program manager's perspective. Admiral Ted Parker, who was OPNAV and ComOpTev 4, was able to give his perspective. He worked on the original requirements for DDG-51. Unfortunately, he passed just a few years ago. And Admiral Kay Page contributed as well. She was the first program executive of Aegis BMD, and before that had lots of Aegis experience, including the Aegis technical director. So that was the original, was to document what happened in Aegis and what were the beliefs that made it so successful. The current issue was the desire to do an update. 15 years later, what had happened, and a lot has happened. We followed the same basic outline, and we got many new authors. Many of the original authors, as I said, had passed. We were really lucky to get people with long Aegis and Standard Missile experience, officers, civilians, industry, laboratory, and all of them who share a reverence for the program. Editing all that stuff was a labor of love. It took a while. It took about a year to get this all figured out, and then a little bit longer to get it through NAVC public review, which I won't go into. But we're really proud of what we put together.
Well, I can't wait to read it in detail, and it's reminding me I should go back and look at the original. Many listeners will know who Rear Admiral Wayne E. Meyer is and his role in developing Aegis, but other listeners that are listening are just going to hear of him for the first time. Now, you gave us a little bit of background on who he was, but could you introduce this figure for those of us who do not know of Admiral Meyer, please?
Admiral Meyer is most remembered for being the founding project manager, and I use that word specifically because programs and projects were different in those days. Projects were bigger. He was the founding project manager of Aegis, first the weapon system, then the combat system, and then what was called the Aegis shipbuilding program from 1970 to 1983. 1983, he was, as he used to boast, fired for the first time by John Lehman, the Secretary of the Navy. And he always said he got fired a second time when he was retired in 1985. He had 20 years of operational experience. Then he became an engineering duty officer after several engineering degrees, led Port Hueneme as the second chief engineer. Port Hueneme wasn't even established until a few years before he got there. Then he was moved into the job of Aegis Weapon System Program Manager, which included the development of Standard Missile 2. Aegis successfully progressed in development. The Aegis Combat System was born in '76, and it was very ambitious. And by this time, Meyer had been promoted to Rear Admiral and reported to the commander of the newly formed NAVC. NAVC, Naval Sea Systems Command, hadn't even been formed until 1974. Prior to that, he had worked in the Naval Ordnance Systems Command, which was went away in 1974 as the Ship System Command and the Ordnance System Command combined. He was a force of nature. Anybody who ever knew him, he wasn't a terribly tall man, but anybody who recounted him walking into a room would swear that he was bigger and filled up the room. There was never a lesson that he didn't forget. He grew up on the farm in Missouri during the Great Depression, so a lot of those really hard-learned lessons of how to make damn sure something worked when you put it out there, because when he was growing up, you would die if you didn't make sure the cows were milked or you seeded the fields, things like that. He brought that same Missouri pragmatism into the development of the Aegis weapon system. the integrated nature of the Aegis weapon system would not have happened if it wasn't for him. Meyer had lived through the Terrier, Tartar, and Talos missile systems, which oftentimes didn't work. They couldn't have many missiles in the air. There weren't enough spares to go around. The training was not as good as it could have been. And everything Meyer did was, we are going to fix that if it's the last thing I ever do. And professionally, it was the last thing he ever did. When he retired, he remained a trusted advisor to many people in the Navy, active duty, laboratories, industry, because of that incredible experience he had, especially Aegis ballistic missile defense. The people who got Aegis ballistic missile defense to work had Meyer as their senior advisory team leader. And it really, I think you can credit Meyer with a lot of their success, never letting them forget the hard-won lessons that Aegis had gone through. I always like to say one of Admiral Meyer's cronies would go around and say, Marion Oliver from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, he used to say, everybody has a right to make their own mistakes, but not to repeat mine. And Meyer was a big fan of that and never would let somebody else have to make mistakes that were learned really the hard way under Aegis. Prince of a man, he was hard to work for sometimes, but he was never mean and nasty to you. He would always try and lift you up, even if he just really came down on you hard, he would lift you up at the end and say, you're better than this. I know you can give me more. And he did. He got incredible amounts of work out of people that never thought they could do what they did.
Troy, let's review some of the major sections in this work. There's an introduction by Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral James Kilby. The CEO notes is a portion of this podcast, Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, my interview with the Honorable Sean Stackley, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition. You and John Gwynn write on the strategic environment and threat evolution. What will the audience learn from that article?
Well, let me just hit each of these, the authors that you let in with, because it was a real coup and a great thing that we got Admiral Kilby. He is a longtime Aegis sailor. He also helped to operationalize some of the early Aegis BMD capabilities out there on the USS Monterey. So it was great to see his perspective. He understood what it took to get something out there, operating and maintained, and continue with the training for the follow-on sailors. Admiral Mann and Paul Dickinson, they agreed to co-author the article, which was a great signal to everybody that there's no error between what PEO IWS and Aegis BMD are doing to modernize our fleet in the face of some new threats. And Paul Mann specifically had years of coaching from Admiral Meyer and was able to put much of it to work during his storied career. He's somebody you may want to interview someday because his career was just fascinating, including MRAP, which is an experience of mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle, which we put out there as fast as you can put a program out there. Sean Stackley, the longest-serving ASN RDA from 2008 to 2017, also served in Aegis as a production officer for DDG 51. He knew Admiral Meyer well and would often seek his advice and would often get unsolicited advice from Admiral Meyer, as Admiral Meyer was wont to do. He was a big decision maker, Mr. Stackley, for the restart of the DDG 51 program and the design and construction of the Flight 3 ships, which are recounted in several of the articles. He also got personally involved in restoring Aegis readiness, which had waned in the 2010 to 2012 timeframe. Admiral Meyer always wanted us to start with the threat in any presentation we did because that was the reason we were there. So that's why John Gwynn and I, who he got out of the Navy as a lieutenant and is still in the Naval Reserves and works with me at the Missile Defense Agency, we went into a deep dive on the threats. And in the last 15 years, the threats have really progressed. So much so, I don't think most of America understands just what's been happening. The four countries of concern, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, out of them all, China, by far the biggest concern. They've developed offensive missiles with unprecedented capabilities, and their naval buildup has made them the world's largest Navy by numbers since 2016. And just last year, we always used to say, well, at least their ships are smaller, ours are still bigger. Well, that went away last year. They now have more naval tonnage than we do as well. It's a military modernization over the last 30 years that rivals what the Soviets did in the 50s and 60s. they have gone from being not very capable at all to absolutely a capable Navy and a capable military. The question now for all of us is, what are they going to do with it? Iran has been an aspiring regional hegemon and has been causing all sorts of trouble with the three H's, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. All of those bad actors have been using missiles provided from Iran. Aegis ships and sailors now have a vast majority of their combat experience from defending against the Iran-provided missiles in the Red Sea, and then later on, the missiles that were hitting Israel 3 separate times in April of 2024, October of 2024, and then most recently last month. Those medium-range ballistic missiles launched against Israel were exactly what Aegis ballistic missile defense was created for, and they had some incredible results. Russia is a shadow of what the Soviet Union used to be, but they've been slowly modernizing their fleet, and they have many more modern offensive capabilities that have been on display for the world in Ukraine. Their experience with drone warfare with the Ukrainians has shown you just how fast a warfare area can evolve. So the drone warfare is literally evolving day by day over there. Cat, mouse, somebody advances, somebody defends, then they have to change that day by day. North Korea, although still a hermit kingdom and almost a negligible contributor to the world's economy, because of their nuclear weapons and missiles, gets outsized attention, extending to ICBM ranges. They've also supplied Russia with artillery rounds, ballistic missiles, and even soldiers to fight in the Ukrainian conflict. These 4 countries are not really allies, but they are beginning to act a little more like allies, and this should really concern us going forward.
I think the cornerstone of this edition is the article presented by yourself, Rear Admiral Tom Drugan, and Jim Peluso, entitled Aegis Combat System Evolution and Modernization. What are the key points that are brought through this piece?
Well, the piece begins with Aegis having to climb out of a hole in the 2009-2010 timeframe. We had been at war in the Middle East for about 6 years at that point in time. The Navy was not a main contributor because of the nature of the war, not because the Navy wasn't good, it just wasn't a contributor in that war. And a lot of resources have been pulled away from the Navy, including from Aegis surface ships, to pay for the war. By 2010, the readiness of the ships, specifically of the radars, was really in the tank, and a readiness review was chartered by Mr. Sean Stackley to figure out what the shortcomings were in training, parts, fleet firings of missiles, manning, all during a time when the ships were beginning to experience an increased operational tempo. Ultimately, resources were provided to improve fleet readiness. During that 2009 to 2024 timeframe, a lot of new capabilities were put to sea for Aegis. Aegis ballistic missile defense, a long-range Standard Missile 3, a shorter-range Standard Missile 6, over-the-horizon anti-air warfare with a capability called Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, or NIFCA for short. Aegis had always been introduced in capabilities in what's called baselines. The latest baseline, Baseline 9, was going to realize true integrated air and missile defense capability and the ability to do ballistic missile defense and anti-air warfare at the same time. Up until this point, you had to do either or with your combat system. So that was introduced. And then the latest capability that was put to sea, Baseline 10, which carried a brand new radar to sea, the first biggest new radar introduced in the history of Aegis, the SPY-6, which would be an active radar as opposed to a SPY-1, which is a passive radar that was really going to help us push and pace the evolution of ballistic and air threats. There was also a significant effort to modernize cruisers and destroyers to improve capabilities and extend service lives. One of the ways that we were going to keep the fleet numbers up was by extending service lives of Aegis ships, and part of that modernization was to do just that. There was also an acceleration of commercial off-the-shelf upgrades for computers, going away from military standard computers, which were the only option in the early days of Aegis, to now where the government is in the backseat and commercial industry is on the forefront of pushing computer technology. Well, Aegis wanted to harness that and put that into the combat system and the weapon system, and they're doing just that. And now we're embarking on something called the Integrated Combat System that is going to further enable commercial computing, more rapid capability delivery, and a more common combat system architecture across different ships, not just combatants like Aegis ships, cruisers, and destroyers, but also the ship self-defense system, also called SSDS, equipped ships in the fleet, primarily the amphibious ships as well.
Troy, it's amazing to imagine how many partner nations now have Aegis. Mary Leonard Kiefer wrote on the extensiveness of foreign military sales of Aegis in The Expanding International World of Aegis. What other countries now have this combat system in their fleet?
Well, in 2009, when the period for this particular edition starts, Spain, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Norway, all had variants of the Aegis weapon system and combat system on their ships. The most interesting thing about the article is how each country has adopted Aegis for their combat system needs. Making warships is a significant commitment of a nation's national treasure. And the idea that they're just going to take this and ship billions of dollars over to the United States without a penny going to their local economy is hard for a lot of countries to swallow. I know it would be for ours. So each of these countries has come up with their own way to kind of share development of the Aegis combat system and weapon system, so much so that Spain even now has become a supplier of some of the SPY-7 radar, which has been put into some of these international variants. A pretty significant thing that's happened to build up their industrial base on the one hand, so that they could get their local legislatures to agree to this. And on the other hand, it gives us a second source of supply so that we've got the ability to surge if needed. It's positioned Spain as a manufacturing supplier for the SPY-7 radar worldwide. There's other countries that are doing that as well. And right now, Canada and Norway are going to be joining the Aegis family once again. Japan is finishing 2 Aegis system equipped vessels, which are going to provide more of a national missile defense, along with the Standard Missile 3 Block 2A, the latest version of Standard Missile 3 for ballistic missile defense. So it's really amazing. Each country has found their own way to get the benefits of Aegis, but also retain a lot of the benefits for their own economies.
The word evolution is used often in the story of Aegis. This is probably salient because Rear Admiral Wayne Meyer's mantra, build a little, test a little, learn a lot. And I've always say that this podcast title is an homage to that mantra. So I was not surprised when I saw evolution used again in the title Standard Missile Evolution, written by Jim Roberts and Brian Durant. What does this article tell us about an important part, the kinetic element of the weapon system?
There were several key evolutions for Standard Missile from 2009 to today. In the article, Captain Durant, Jim Roberts, and Commander Connor all call this first evolving the battle space up with Standard Missile 3, then evolving the battle space out with Standard Missile 6, and finally expanding the battle space for more ship classes with Standard Missile 2 Block 3C. Also covered is sustainment. It's a huge topic for ordnance, because if the ordnance isn't ready, who cares how much of it you have? So keeping that ordnance ready and figuring out new, better ways to not only keep it ready, but to provide upgraded capabilities, sometimes even without having to take it out of the ship and bring it to a depot, is part of the story. Standard Missile 3 evolved from something called Standard Missile 3 Block 1A, which was out there before 2009, to the Standard Missile 3 Block 1B, most notably adding a more advanced seeker, the ability to have 2 colors of infrared so that they could better discriminate, and a throttleable divert and attitude control system for the 4th stage, also called the kinetic warhead. This allowed it to really maintain more propulsion when needed to be able to go further and really hit some of these advanced threats, which might be able to maneuver better than the threats had in the past. It further evolved into what's called the Standard Missile 3 Block 2A. Now, this missile got rid of the 13.5-inch constraint of the second, third, and fourth stage that we had dealt with before, and made the entire missile the same diameter as the first stage, the 21 inches that we had put in the Mark 72 rocket motor ever since the 90s. It also was able to upgrade the seeker, put a new clamshell style nose cone on it, and a lightweight canister. Because this missile became awfully heavy, the total weight in the vertical launching system was about to be hit. So you needed to take weight out of somewhere. We were able to do it with the canister that holds the missile. Standard Missile 6 evolved two ways. One, from Standard Missile 2 rocket motors, and then from the AMRAAM missile seeker that had been used for years. This was an active seeker instead of a passive seeker like we had on Standard Missile 2. So there was actually a radar on board this new Standard Missile 6 that could illuminate a target itself without having to rely on illumination from ship illuminators, which the Standard Missile 2 had done for years. It added missions over time. So instead of just doing anti-air warfare, we added a ballistic missile defense capability, a hypersonic missile defense capability, and a strike capability, anti-surface warfare. So this has become really the Swiss Army knife for the fleet, allowing flexibility for changing missions, even on a single deployment. Very flexible for commanders who are always worried about, do I have enough of each type of missile in my magazines? Standard Missile 2 Block 3C takes the propulsion stack of Standard Missile 2, regrains the existing rocket motors to add service life, and adds an active seeker like the Standard Missile 6 to the front end instead of the Standard Missile 2's semi-active seeker. Enhanced maneuverability was added by putting what's called jet tabs into the rocket plume to give it more maneuverability to handle today's threats. And because it is a shorter missile than Standard Missile 6 or Standard Missile 3, it has applicability to more of our allies' ship classes as well. So it really can help not just arm us, more ship classes within our fleet, but our allies as well.
The Future of Aegis was written by Admirals Kate Page and John Ailes and Lieutenant Commander Russ Allen. What do they envision for Aegis, and might this be a view to our next story of Aegis 30 years later?
Well, I hope a lot of the things they write about come to pass in the next 15 years. We were really lucky to get Admirals Page and Ailes. They have long Aegis and Aegis BMD experience, and they teamed with Lieutenant Commander Russ Allen, whose very recent operational experience and experience heading the Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense real-world ops cell down in Dahlgren at Aegis BMD's facility down there. It was really great to get them all to be able to put that into one article. In the near future, recent world events have shown us that integrated air and missile defense is a prerequisite for any fight. Our adversaries' preferred weapons are missiles, and it is not going to change anytime soon. Whatever capabilities we put out there have got to be ready, and keeping more of our fleet combat ready is going to be a priority. The speed of upgrades enabled by digital engineering tools, which we're adopting, and improved architectures are going to enable the use of artificial intelligence to help crews with sensor and engagement coordination between units. The authors end by reminding us never to forget the fundamentals of Aegis that Admiral Meyer taught us that still apply more than 50 years into Aegis development. The one that most applies today is to engineer margin into the system. So can you add a little extra capability just in case the threat changes? It is one of the key things that allowed Aegis, specifically the Spy-1 radar, to evolve to a ballistic missile defense system mission, something that was never even considered back in the early days, primarily because ballistic missiles in that era were not a threat to the fleet. That has changed dramatically. And if that margin wasn't allowed in that original system, and if Admiral Meyer didn't insist on it, we would have been in a world of hurt. It's tough to get OSD and CAPE and all these other organizations to let you engineer something that you don't need right now, but it's really key to being able to grow in the future.
Indeed. So finally, there is a piece about Rear Admiral Meyer's legacy at the Naval Postgraduate School. What is happening there to ensure that his lessons remain?
Well, the Navy is seriously fortunate to have John Hammerer he was an apostle of Wayne Meyer. and helped operationalize the Aegis component of the ballistic missile defense system in the 2000s. He's helping the next generation of Aegis leaders studying various subjects at the Naval Postgraduate School to understand what's made Aegis great, how Aegis has to change to face future threats, and what it takes to get ready, sustainable, and effective capabilities to the fleet. I mean, he is a real treasure, and I've had the chance to go out there 3 different times to brief his students and to meet them and understand what they're working on. And wow, are they impressive. And they have to do the Meyer Scholar work, which is the organization that he formed out there, on top of their other coursework for their postgraduate degrees. So these people are gung-ho, and thank God John Hammer is out there, because he's really been able to groom a new generation of people, and they're already starting to populate key positions within Aegis and Aegis BMD.
Troy, is there anything else that you would like to share with the ASNE audience?
Well, 13 years with Admiral Meyer, I learned that he used to talk and talk a lot, sometimes way longer than you wanted to, but it helped make it seep into your brain and impress upon anyone that would listen that naval engineering is unforgiving, and the sea would ultimately test your designs in ways that you could never foresee. Therefore, you had to have a structure in place to learn, adapt those designs to what it was seeing out in the real world, and keep systems, which include people, capable and ready. This is what makes the difference between victory and defeat. Don't just think you're working on an acquisition program. Meyer never even used the word acquisition. He used to throw his hands up in the air and say, nobody even knows what the hell that means. He was trying to get out there a capability to make sure that we would win if we had to go to war. So don't be satisfied with less than an ideal organization for the problem that you're working on. It was a huge part of Aegis's success, and it's one of those Aegis lessons that's timeless as well.
Fantastic. Well, then, thank you, Troy Kimmel, for taking this time to discuss the story of Aegis 15 years later. I want to say to the audience that today we just hit the highlights. I hope that the listeners will delve into this special edition in more detail to appreciate this important part of naval engineering. Troy, of course, I hope that we can welcome you again back to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the podcast of the American Society of Naval Engineers.
Thank you, Stephen, and I hope your listeners enjoy the story of Aegis 15 years later.